Feminist criticism. Feminist criticism developed from the women's movement in Europe and North America in the 1960s, the so-called second wave of feminism. This movement was characterized by the founding of a number of consciousness-raising groups whose fundamental beliefs can be summarized by the slogan, quote, "The personal is political," unquote, meaning that personal experience is neither individual nor isolated, rather it is social, political, and systematic. First wave feminism, which began around 1860, page 528 continued, and started to decline in 1918, secured rights that were previously denied women, such as the right to education and the right to vote. Various works of feminist literary criticism came out of and followed on from the first wave, such as Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, 1929, and many such writings share a number of concerns apparent in more recent work. However, such early works were relatively isolated, and it was not until the early 1970s that feminist criticisms began to constitute a body of study with its own distinct identity. This identity has never been homogeneous. It has varied according to the identity and political perspective of the individual critic. Moreover, it has changed through time as critics have responded to beg your pardon, I repeat. Moreover, it has changed through time as critics have responded to and developed the work of their predecessors. Para. Three groups of feminists. All feminists share together the central concern, namely the parity of the two sexes, and yet they are far from being a homogeneous group, voicing identical concerns in identical ways. Jen Freeman classifies feminism into three principal groups as follows. 1. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminists work within a liberal state. They do not question the structure, economic or political, of the state, but they demand that the rights and privileges given by the state should be equally shared by men and women. 2. Marxist and socialist feminism. Feminists of this category interlink the oppression of women and the exploitation of the working class in the capitalist economic system. Women suffer a double exploitation as women and as members of the working class. 3. Radical feminism. Radical feminists disregard all questions of political and economic dispensation to concentrate on the roots of the problem. The central root of the problem is the system of patriarchy, which leads to all kinds of discrimination against the devaluation of women. Politico-economic questions are not the roots but only auxiliaries. The concept of gender is the real villain and has to be demolished. Page 529. Para. Jen Freeman, while identifying these three categories of feminism, ignores some other feminisms such as black feminism and post-colonial feminism, which interlink the oppression of women with, respectively, the exploitation of black natives by the white masters and that of the third world natives by their colonial masters. Friedman's focus on centrality is perhaps the explanation. Para. The central issue, sex and gender. As we have pointed out above, the central, radical, or essential focus of all kinds of feminism is the unjust discrimination between men and women when they are both human beings. Here we may explain the difference between sex and gender. Feminists insist, and insist rightly, that while sex is real and biological, gender is nothing real but only a social construction. A woman is not born but made by the patriarchal society with its concept of all the do's and don'ts for women which ensure subordinate status for them. This is the central issue, and all kinds of feminism take their roots from it and develop themselves in various directions according to their local and circumstantial concerns and requirements. Para. Thus, feminists of the world are not a coherent and unanimous lot. However, in their radical concern, as we have pointed out above, there is absolute unanimity among them. Gender inequalities and oppressions manifest themselves differently in different societies and at different times. For example, one of the major problems today in our own country is that of dowry deaths. While Indian feminists are overtly occupied by it, their foreign counterparts have other local concerns. Para. Feminists both are united and a divided lot. Even on some fundamental universal questions, feminists are not an altogether united lot. Their mutual debates are often acrimonious. Take, for example, the question of prostitution, pornography, and homosexuality. Most feminists attack prostitution as something degrading to women. It is men who commodify women as objects of male pleasure. However, a few feminists are not against having male prostitutes or gigolos, whose services may be available to desirous women for a price. The motive is revenge, pure and simple. Pornography is also attacked for its tendency to objectify women. As somebody has said, pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. As regards homosexuality, particularly lesbianism, a huge majority of feminists are in its favor. Complete withdrawal from heterosexuality affirms woman's independence. Lesbianism, with or without the sexual component, is considered by most feminists as an assertion of woman's independence. Para. Feminist criticism is one of the latest literary trends in modern literary criticism. The women's liberation movement of the late 1960s is the main motivating force behind this movement. Helen Helena Sixous, Cixous apostrophe, Sorties, Sorties 1975. Elaine, Elaine, Showalter, Showalter apostrophe S, a literature of their own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, 1977, and her lecture towards feminist poetics published in Women's Writing and Writing About Women, 1979, Juliet Mitchell's essay, Women, the Longest Revolution, published in New Left Review, 1966, and Psychoanalysis and Feminism, 1974. Luce Irigaray, Irigaray apostrophe S, Speculum of the Other Woman, 1985, and This Sex Which Is Not One, 1985. Patrocinio P. Schweikart, Schweickart, Schweikart's Essay in Gender and Reading, Essays on Readers, Texts and Context, 1986. Eve Kofosky Sedgwick's Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosocial Desire, 1985. And Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's essay, French Feminism in International Frame, published Yale French Studies, 1987, are some important works in the direction of the evolution of feminist criticism. David Lodge points out, quote, the initial effort of feminist critics was to revise orthodox male literary history, exposing sexual stereotyping in canonical texts, and reinterpreting or reviving the works of women writers, para. The feminine viewpoint was ignored in literary criticism due to male supremacy. Virginia Woolf was the forerunner of the freedom of thought and expression for women. Virginia Woolf, Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, and Margaret Duras, satirized the sterile narcissism of male scholarship and celebrated women's fortunate exclusion from its patriarchal methodology. Feminine criticism was based on, the authority of experience, of women writers and thinkers. Thus, it is original and innovative. It is a powerful organ for the expression of feminine sensibility and aspirations in innovative linguistic and stylistic patterns. Feminist criticism is concerned with the interpretation and reinterpretation of texts of women writers. According to Elaine Showalter, feminist criticism must be, women experience-centered, independent and intellectually coherent, page 530. According to her, its methodology should be clearly charted out and developed. I must find its own subject, its own system, its own theory, and its own voice, It is, a sustained investigation of literature by women, It is the study of, women as writers, and its subjects are the history, styles, themes, genres, and structures of writings by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, the trajectory of the individual or the collective female career, and the evolution of laws of female literary tradition, Showalter sums up, this specialized critical discourse, in one word, gynocritics, Gynocicritics, The feminist theorists are concerned with women's writings. There have been certain studies which center around the critical appraisal of women writers. They are Ellen Moore's Literary Women, 1976, Showalter's A Literature of Their Own, 1977, Nina Baim's, BAYM', Women's Fiction, 1978, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guber's The Mad Woman in the Attic, Margaret Homan's Women Writers and Poetic Identity, 1980, and a large number of papers and articles. Feminist criticism widely differs from male-centric criticism in the sense that it is concerned with varied aspects of feminism. Feminist criticism in each country has a different center which is related with one or other aspect of womanhood. Showalter sums up, English feminist criticism, essentially Marxist, stresses oppression, French feminist criticism, especially psychoanalyst, stresses expression, American feminist criticism, essentially textual, stresses expression, All, however, have become gynocentric, Gynocritics reveal that they are concerned with something solid, enduring, and real about the relation of women to literary culture. Feminist criticism is also concerned with women's language. Women writers have to cultivate linguistic and stylistic devices which spontaneously express feminine sensibility and individuality. Women must express themselves both, body and soul, in a feminist language. Feminist criticism is also related with women's psyche and their culture. Para. The term New Historicism signifies a group of common or generally shared tendencies, concerns and priorities which characterize the mode of critical and literary studies of some British and American writers who first appeared in the 1980s. It must be pointed out at the outset that, quote, New Historicism, unquote, is not a school of criticism, but it must be pointed out at the outset that, quote, New Historicism, unquote, is not a, quote, school, unquote, of criticism, unlike, say, the new critics who made up a fairly homogeneous group of people, all of whom believed in identical principles such as the pure concern with words on the page, a complete disregard of biographical details, etc. New Historicism is not a school in this sense. What brings various new historicists under the same rubric is their central emphasis on historicity in the sense of politics, culture, economic, sense of identity of the author as well as of the critic, the subtleties of the social and economic equation between the cultural producer and the consumer of the text, and so on. Nowadays, the two major streams of literary study which are competing with each other and also to some extent complementing each other are deconstruction and new historicism. Their method may not be very different from each other, but quite often, though not always, a new historicist has a political agenda, whereas a deconstructionist has none. Para. Why, quote, new, unquote, question mark. Quote, New historicism, unquote, is not old historicism renewed. It is essentially radically different. D.J. Palmer observes, colon, quote, the aim of historicism is to make works of different periods more accessible to the modern reader by reconstructing the historically appropriate background as it affects our understanding and judgment of the work concerned, unquote, stop. New historicism doesn't think of history as background, but as a complex cultural process which unfolds around the question of politics, power struggle, performativity, consumption, and above all, identity of gender, class, power groups, and marginalized sections. If around 50 years ago men of letters had existential concerns, they today are grappling with the question of identity, or rather fractured identity of the author, the reader and the critic over the ages, apropos of the politico-economic equations and power struggles. The methods of criticism used by the new historicists are largely deconstructionist, but their horizon is much vaster than the narrowly linguistic analysis of structuralists and deconstructionists both. In short, new historicism is as different from historicism as New York, from York not as New Delhi from Delhi. Para. History as constructed or rather deconstructed by the new historicists is not a coherent record of events interconnected causally, but an interactive process which springs up a number of binaries related to one another in a process which may be dialectical or otherwise. Page 531. And interestingly, new historicism does not engage the historian as a dispassionate and totally objective narrator of the so-called historical facts or events, but as an individual with a decodable identity who is not only a spectator but an ideological component of the historical discourse. A typical new historicist historicizes himself too vis-a-vis the historical material which is the overt object of his study. History or ideology ? Para. We have made above a mention of the political agenda of new historicists. The term history is a neutral or overtly inclusive term. When somebody talks of history, he is expected to specify as to history of what ? The history of the new historicists is basically socio-economic and political, or in other words, ideological. Earlier historicists had emphasized the unifying nature of culture. All the pluralities and diversities of crisscrossing cultural forces were conceptualized by them into a specific GEISI of a given period. By contrast, to quote Don E. Wayne, W-A-Y-N-E, new historicists are often most interested in how different kinds of discourse intersect, contradict, destabilize, cancel, or modify each other. Para. But however complex these intersections and contradictions are represented to be, some new historicists' analysis of such a complex structure of interrelated discourses and practices will, to quote Wayne, ultimately be resolved into an ideological dominant. Historical studies of this type seek to demonstrate how a dominant ideology will give a certain reign to alternative discourses, ultimately appropriating their vitality and containing their oppositional force. Some examples of this kind of new historicist reading are Stephen Greenblatt's essay Invisible Bullets and Jonathan Goldberg's book James Land, The Politics of Literature. Para. Some critics like Carolyn Porter and Alan Sinfield, and even a few new historicists like Richard Helgeson, have disapproved of such emphasis on the identification of an all-containing dominant ideology at a given juncture in a society. As Wayne puts it, quote, the emphasis is new historicism will not be the triumph of one set of ideas and values over others, but rather on the strategies and tactics by which hierarchies are sustained and power, however modified, is reasserted. Para. Most new historicists emphasize difference and discontinuity while studying the past in relation to the present. All kinds of universalization and continuity are strictly eschewed. However, most of them disagree with the deconstructionist reading of history on a fundamental point. The deconstructionists underline the essential unknowability of the past and therefore the fallacy of all value judgments. This position is disputed by many new historicists such as Jerome J. McGann, McGann, Michael G. Cook, Cooke, and Clifford Siskin, Siskin. The new historicist reading of history and historiography is chiefly indebted to the French historian Michel Foucault, whose view on history and such literary matters as author function, literary canon, literary production and consumption, etc., offered new insight. About the influence of Foucault, David Punter observes, quote, for the new historicist, the influence of Foucault, among others, entails seeing history as a series of discursive practices or interlocking ideologies, History is a struggle for power, certainly, but the power sought is over discursive space, and the fate of the underling is to be robbed of his or her language for the older Marxist historians. Historicity consists of such old-fashioned things as actions, movements and events, and a type of political judgment is possible which relates these past events to the present and permits value judgments upon them. Not so for the new historicists for whom the struggle of discourses is ineluctable, and who at their most extreme represent a variety of determinism which would have shaken the good Victorian Marx to his social foundation." Unquote, stop. A fine example of such new historicist criticism is Siskin's The Historicity of Romantic Discourse, 1988, which tries to establish that the major Romantic poets struggled with problems which were not universal and very profound, but were really their own historical products. Siskin shows that deconstructionist writers like Harold Bloom and D. Mann, who thought otherwise about the Romantics, worked under a fallacy. Stop.